Welcome to Beanstalk, M&J's podcast where we are sharing and showcasing our areas of expertise through conversations with practice leaders on their knowledge and experience. As business leaders, we all want to see our revenue charts go up and to the right. But there's a massive difference between a business that is just simply growing in revenue versus one that is actually scaling. During periods of growth, that's when many companies break. Operational systems fail. Cash flow dries up. And that can even be as revenues are increasing. For today's episode, I'm very excited to be joined by the COO of Mauldin Jenkins, a rapidly growing firm to help navigate growing and scaling businesses. COO is Kristen Lord, and Kristen, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. Excited to be here today.
So Kristen, I'm really excited and hyped to talk to you today about just growing businesses and not just growing revenue, but also properly scaling our operations. But before we really dive in, we do a favor for our audience and just kind of give a brief description of your background and your role at Mauldin Jenkins.
So I have been with the firm for 19 years. I started with Mauldin Jenkins right out of college and focused on auditing financial institutions, credit unions, and other financial services organizations. In 2012, I had the opportunity to move to our internal operations side and become the chief financial officer. And so within that role, I was, responsible for financial reporting, budgeting, internal accounting, payroll and benefits. And then about a year and a half ago, transitioned to the chief operating officer role, which just expanded the position to include some other operational organizations within the firm.
And that's, you have that really interesting and comprehensive view from going from that auditor and CPA lens up through, as you described, the CFO of the firm, and then the operations side, from the technical to the strategic. So it's just, I'm really happy for you making the time to talk to me today. Thank you so much. And I also, it's a really great time to talk because I know Mauldin Jenkins is recently did a large expansion out west. So we just talked to me a little bit too about when it comes to a growing business, what scaling looks like. What were some of the main things that you had to navigate at Mauldin Jenkins as a business leader, kind of moving into a new geography and adding, a lot more revenue and also even more headcount?
Sure. When we're evaluating our growth goals, there's several different ways to attack it. You can evaluate growth and do it organically. You can add, new services to clients that you're currently serving and markets that you're already serving. You can expand your services that you provide, or you can expand geographically. So we have decided just recently with this new acquisition we've recently done is to expand into new markets out west.
And when you're looking at an expansion like that, I know that the headcount just has a drastic increase sort of overnight. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the key operational things that you keep top of mind? I guess, what are some of the systems that you're most concerned about that might break?
Oh, that might break. Oh, my goodness. Well, I think we have tried to do a really good job of streamlining a lot of our processes. We utilize a lot of automation and technology, which is a huge help because, in all honesty, sometimes the people part of a process is what can sometimes break, per se, a little quicker. People get, they can be overwhelmed. They can, start to, move out of the way of what our strategic ideas might be. They might not follow policy. So really just leaning on the infrastructure that we've built in terms of automation and streamline our process.
Because it's a lot of change for people, on both sides of an expansion like that, in terms of having new folks who are working with a new territory, and also the folks in that territory working, oftentimes with a new firm that they're merging in with. HR systems are changing, billing systems are changing, a lot of that kind of stuff. So I love that you kind of point to kind of having that stable posture first of the good systems to be merged into, and then also the automation where appropriate. Mm-hmm. Now, I guess when you're kind of having the view that these are things we need to keep top of mind, and they are things that could potentially cause issues if they're not running smoothly, that kind of makes me think too, just before you make a decision like this, Is there anything that you're keeping a close eye on before doing an expansion like this? Kind of financial green lights, I guess I'd call them.
Oh, absolutely. When we're evaluating any sort of, growth in terms of M&A activity, we always evaluate the culture of the other organization. We evaluate their risk tolerance. But, one of the biggest pieces is the financial metrics and how will the two merge together. We evaluate our KPIs in terms and look at theirs to make sure that they may not necessarily be the same, but can they get close? Are there things that Mauldin Jenkins can improve upon that, that the other firm may be doing a great job as, and vice versa?
Yeah, I love that you mentioned culture. Mm-hmm. It's funny because I even framed the question, financial green lights. My brain, just the CPA in my DNA goes straight to what are the financial things we pay attention to? But I think you're spot on that we'll start with culture. And then from there, that culture drives how are we looking at our business, how are we measuring our business, how are we growing our business, and is there alignment there? And it's not just that there's one way to measure and monitor and run a business, and it's our way or the highway. It's also taking some pages out of their playbook too.
Absolutely.
So I love that. Now, I guess too, there's a lot that goes on when it comes to expansion and expansion through a merger like this. I guess how do you kind of distinguish between the good chaos of growth and then just kind of oh no, our systems are being stretched. Sure. Maybe we're kind of hitting almost a point to where something needs to be scaled up a little bit more. Is that something that you feel like you got to kind of keep a pulse on? And if so, how?
Oh, absolutely. During times of growth, it is so important to make sure that you're scaling your operations efficiently and effectively. It's really easy when, there's revenue growth, there's demand for your services or products to just, add. But you don't necessarily want to just do more with more. A company needs to make sure they're evaluating their infrastructure and their resources, whether that be personnel, occupancy, technology, of course, is huge, and just insurance administration, just making sure that people in the leadership team really has their hand on a pulse of what can they do with what they have and how best to structure that in the future for growth.
And so while we're kind of, just thinking about things that can kind of, pull on cash as we're growing, just do you have any kind of, best practices or recommendations for how to manage and monitor cash during periods of growth?
Sure. So we review our cash position report every single day. It's a big part of our operations is where do we stand with our cash position? Some important ways to manage and monitor it is budgeting and forecasting. Refer to your budget. Are you following your plan? When you're looking at forecasting, what's happened in the past or what is going to change that you want to make sure you're planning for. There are a few operational ways to manage cash. You can accelerate your accounts receivable. Is that billing earlier, billing, more frequently, managing the billing process. There's also, managing your payables process. Look at those invoices that come in and say, are they net terms 30? Can you stretch them a little bit if you're really trying to manage your cash? And then also evaluate your infrastructure and resources. Look at what you have internally, look at your operating expenses, and see if there's some tweaks you can make that help you manage your cash.
Well, and those are all good things for us to monitor and keep an eye on and manage to, but also maybe forecast out before we even get ourselves into a growth phase. So it's not like all of a sudden we're growing and we need to be monitoring all this stuff, but kind of keep tabs on it and look ahead toward it. And from that lens too, I guess, before we really push ourselves into a period of growth, are there any kind of financial green lights that you keep in mind of okay, yes, we're ready to push the accelerator a little bit?
That's right. Well, positive cash flow is an important piece to that puzzle because you want to make sure that you can afford any projects or any investments that you're making. Looking whether you're going to fund something through retained earnings, through internal operations of the firm, whether you want to take on some debt, or whether you want to have a capital contribution from your owners. So there's a couple of different ways you can look at that.
And what you're saying kind of makes me think too, just when it comes to kind of fundamentals of business, things like economies of scale. and economies of scope. As we are scaling our business, we do benefit from economy of scale that kind of conceptually we can do more with less, in some ways, have efficiencies in the infrastructure. But that infrastructure does still need to grow. It's not doing more with the exact same infrastructure we had previously. So all the things we were just talking about, that makes total sense, even down to the technology systems that we have. So can you talk to me a little bit more about just like infrastructure and how you navigate that?
Sure, absolutely. So really knowing the limits of and leveraging, your existing system is key. You don't want to necessarily push it to the max, but you want to make sure you can understand and fully utilize it to capacity so you're not doing more with more, like I mentioned before. It's easy to make quick decisions and panic decisions when you're in growth mode because, you feel like there's a lot coming through the pipeline, but, really taking the time, doing an evaluation and understanding, your infrastructure is key. Scaling operations efficiently and effectively sets up a company so revenue growth increases faster than operating expenses. And that's important. And Mauldin Jenkins, looks at that metric at least monthly because we want to ensure that our revenue growth is changing at a higher rate than our operating expenses because that's how you manage your margin.
Well, and at the end of the day, margins is kind of what it's all about, right? In terms of our capital investments, putting forth capital, whether it's the owner capital or any different sources of capital, is to have a scaling business for the margin. So talk me through a little bit more when it comes to kind of from a month-to-month perspective, trying to have those lenses of monitoring the business. What are some KPIs that, might translate to businesses generally or even just professional services that are oftentimes important things that you keep an eye on?
Sure, absolutely. So we had mentioned our gross profit, which of course is revenue less cost to produce that profit. Net profit, which includes all other operating and other expenses. So those are two that of course we study monthly. We also look at our budget to actual comparisons. We want to make sure that our budgeted projections, that we're still on target with those. And if we're not, do we need to adjust, our activity, whether it be our revenue, monitoring that or, managing our expenses. We're going to talk a little bit about cash. Obviously managing or monitoring cash is a huge KPI that we look at, that cash conversion cycle of how quickly we bill our clients, get collections so we can fund our projects and our operating expenses.
Now talking about, growth and goals like having a certain amount of organic growth, but then additionally doing strategic expansions like we were talking about earlier, from Mauldin Jenkins out west. I guess, does that add some complexities to all those different things you were just discussing, man? Because especially from a cash perspective, I know anytime we're in growth, just, as a practitioner, often I'm like, oh, I need more resources, almost kind of like hiring ahead of the revenue. Well, that causes strains on cash. Or even when we have folks who are growing their services and doing more and more, well, maybe the administrative stuff starts to kind of take a back seat, like getting out timely invoices. I guess, do those things kind of ring true to you looking at from like a firm-wide perspective, just a business leader C-suite perspective? And what other kind of things like that you have to, navigate and help manage around?
Oh, absolutely. In terms of our partners and director group, which is our client executive group, we want to make sure that they have a focus on growth, but also understand that the services they provide, it's important to keep a business mind in terms of those. Are they pricing things appropriately? Are, looking at profitability? We want to make sure that they're managing their collections. So the project is not really complete until the cycle is complete. So we want to make sure that we're communicating that to our client executives so they can understand the full business cycle.
Now, I guess I'm just curious too, from your perspective, just your overarching background of the technical side of the CPA, the auditor, the CFO, now the COO, focus on operations and strategy. Just what are some of important trends from your perspective? What are things kind of looking forward strategically, and just kind of where business is going, where the economy is going, where professional services is going, where the accounting profession is going? Just kind of what are things top of mind for Kristen?
No, that's a great question. So we definitely keep our, finger on the pulse in terms of what's changing in the profession. There's a lot of discussion about what the requirements are to become licensed, and we want to make sure that we're keeping and fostering a good, strong pipeline of those that are in the CPA profession. That's important for us to keep everything moving forward. We also really focus and do a lot of studies and trainings with IT. I mean, obviously AI is huge right now, and so Mauldin Jenkins has various committees and different task force that are really looking into how can we use AI with, of course, keeping a human in the loop, very important, but taking advantage of the resources that we have available to us and that are out there so we can better serve our clients.
Well, and on the realm of technology, I know people who listen to this podcast series a lot know that Brandon loves technology. And I'm always trying to find ways to solve problems with technology and also constantly ask ourselves, are we relevant? Is our business relevant? And oftentimes, how are we using technology as a strategic differentiator to make sure we're monitoring our relevancy? But the truth, too, is that technology is not always cheap. Mm-hmm. So you have to be mindful and strategic of that spend, too, right?
Absolutely. Yep. But, it is so important. And, we're able to do things now with technology that we could only dream of. So we have to be able to use it and leverage it to, our benefit.
And two, when it comes to the data governance, something where we're keeping an eye on, just doing it securely.
Absolutely.
Well, I guess from that sense, too, just think about IT security, from an operations perspective, having IT within your, kind of realm. Is that something that you have a close eye on and pay close attention to in terms of just what are different security threats that are out there, and then how is the firm helping to make sure they're navigating those?
Oh, yes. I mean, there's probably not a day that goes by that I don't think somehow about security, IT security, risks, and what's out there. We work really closely with our internal technology team. Our firm does a great job of sharing information with our employees related to what could happen, what they're seeing, out in the world in terms of people trying to attack our data or, anything like that. But I think we really keep technology and security top of mind.
Yeah. And just in this world of lots of change from the perspective of our technology, change from the perspective of just how our operating models are evolving, change from the perspective of growth, like we've been talking about, it kind of makes me start thinking about communication. How communication for an organization when we were 300, 400, 500 employees is different at 700, 800 plus employees. So from an operations perspective, I guess, how do you view communications? Have your communication strategies had to evolve? Have your interdepartmental relationships had to evolve? I guess, what does communication look like as you grow?
Well, we now have almost 1,000 employees, or we will have them, closer to the end of January with our new hires and interns. And I think we have to always remember people consume communication differently. For some folks, an email will suffice. Some people prefer a podcast. Some like recorded videos, live training. So there's different ways for people to, absorb their communication, and we try to provide different methods, to make sure that we're covering everyone, whether it's a newsletter or, an email or some sort of live training.
Well, and that's something, even me with my teams, I'm always just saying, I don't care how you communicate with me, whether it's a phone call, a text message, an email, a G-chat, a Teams message, whatever it could be, just communicate. Mm-hmm. But definitely when you elevate that to the firm at large with a lot of different people, a lot of different messages that need to go out, I can understand how it's important to kind of meet people where they are and ensure that the messaging is to them, the training is to them, the videos are to them, the communication's coming out. And I do kind of wonder, too, when it comes to just scaling and growing and being concerned about things that can kind of break down and hit breaking points, that communication is one of those. I guess, when it comes to your, operational lens of just keeping an eye on systems that have been working well but are now kind of potentially reaching breaking points, is communication something you keep an eye on? And I guess what are other things that you always have to kind of monitor to make sure aren't breaking down or reaching a breaking point?
Oh, absolutely. In terms of growth, people don't get a handbook on what to do when you're successfully growing a business. So I think it's so important to make sure, you're keeping a pulse on your people and your communication. Management can clearly identify when a software change is needed, when an occupancy change is needed, when you're meeting capacity. But, getting people to manage growth is very important to make sure that they're keeping up with our internal policies, our strategic direction, that they're not overworked or overwhelmed. So just, keeping up with communication to make sure that our people are successful.
And, thinking about capacity, it makes me, just not long ago, I just made a joke about somebody like me, in the professional services side, kind of almost wanting to hire before the revenue, prepare for growth, be postured for growth. And you, from looking at that firm-wide perspective, from a capacity level, just during scaling, how do you handle like resource management? How do you handle and look at capacity, especially in your seat where you're helping manage multiple different departments with multiple different objectives? I guess how do you tackle that during periods of growth?
Sure. Well, in terms of reviewing and looking at personnel from a firm-wide perspective, we're selling time. Mauldin Jenkins sells our time. And so it's important that we're looking to see that people are productive, people are utilized, but not necessarily overutilized or overworked. We really want to make sure there's a good balance of, are you able to do your job successfully? Do you feel like you have the resources and, team members to help you when you need it? So that's a big piece when we're doing our personnel review, is what do we have in our bench strength? What do we really need to add? Just looking at historical numbers, projections, and trying to find a happy medium in terms of our growth. When it comes to managing teams, I think it's just so important to, be there for them, be a listening ear, ask if they need help. That's huge. You never know if someone's going home and working 12, 15 hours a day. We wouldn't want that. So it's, what resources do you need? Have those touch points and make sure that you're communicating with your team.
Yeah, and I can definitely in a professional services space where, and I've heard you say multiple times, our people are our asset. They're our greatest strength. So really making sure that you're keeping a close eye on our people, and I love that idea, of how, keeping tabs on utilization, but that's both ends need to be monitored.
Absolutely.
Overutilized too is something that needs to be navigated. And then also just that kind of career path, that career trajectory for each one too, even to get down to the individual level. And so as you're growing and adding new opportunities, just making sure there is an avenue for each. And that's something, for me on the advisory side, just always mindful of, okay, as we're adding new service segments, new ways of helping our clients, is there a path for those people? So, and Kristen, that kind of makes me think too, this episode is coming out during Women's History Month. And just seeing, a successful business leader like yourself who has worked through the technical route of a CPA and an auditor to a CFO in the C-suite to a strategic operations professional. Kind of walking through that journey, I guess, were there points in your career where you feel like you felt like you had to kind of make adjustments, kind of, present yourself a little bit differently to kind of serve in the new roles? I guess, can you kind of talk me through what your experience has been just growing through your career?
Sure. Well, when I was an auditor, I reported up through the industry partner group. And so, I was a supervisor, I had an in-charge, a manager, director that all worked really closely with me, but also was able to kind of manage the risk and what I was doing and making sure that I was, checking all the boxes and doing all the right things in terms of completing the audit. When I transitioned over to the chief financial officer role, it was a big change, and it was an exciting change because I got to really see how a business works and how a business runs. From an audit perspective, I had prepared financial statements, I had audited financial statements, but now I was really responsible for what are they telling us? What do we need to do with this information? And I was also, young into my career. I had maybe 6 years of experience, and so communicating with seasoned partners, tenured partners, those that had a lot more experience than me, was a little bit daunting. And, really just trying to learn from my supervisor, our managing partner at the time, and our current managing partner in, really just taking advantage of those that I work with and using them as a sounding board is really great advice that I received.
Well, and kind of as you've progressed throughout your career, has your communication style had to change as the rooms you've been in have changed?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. You even just in this room right now, it just feels a little different than other communication methods in the past. But really, we're a larger firm than we were, years ago. So just different ways we're communicating. Again, I know we spoke a little earlier about people consume it differently, but when you're generating an email or you're writing an email or you're, recording a presentation, you really want to make sure that you're clear and concise in your communication, that you're getting the point across, you're not too wordy or wasting people's time, because you want to make sure that you're best respecting people's time.
Yeah. And just kind of, seeing how you have that full view of business from the technical to the strategic. And as we've been talking about concepts like risk management, growing and scaling operations, technology, new technologies, emerging technologies, governance around considerations, managing resources, keeping an eye on the business, the financials, important KPIs, and then helping, influence behavior around that. I guess to everyone kind of working their way up to a career listening in, and especially today during Women's History Month, women listening in, are there any kind of top line considerations that you'd really encourage all of them to focus on as they're advancing their career? So some of the headline things that can really help them accelerate their careers and really understand the businesses that they're working in and help them move up the chain in those businesses.
Oh, absolutely. I think a big piece of advice would be a lifetime learner. Never stop reading, never stop asking questions, always try to sit at a table with people that you've never sat at a table with before. You never know what you're going to take away from someone that you have not talked to before. But, we're so lucky in that we have so much access to resources in terms of the financial profession literacy. We get, email blasts in terms of, what's going on in the economy. It's really important for someone who has a goal to be in the C-suite or any leadership role is to never stop learning and never stop asking questions.
I love that. And just the curiosity of it. Kind of, exactly as you're describing, just always being curious and then just lifetime learning and never feeling like I know it all. I think that speaks very real to my experience as well. And also for you, you're very active in the community through things like Leadership Cobb. You were previously awarded a 40 under 40 award. To me, mentorship has been something that's helped in my career. From your perspective too, to have the accolades you've received, it's clear beyond just mentorship, kind of sponsorship. Kind of people behind the scenes who have helped you with your career. I guess, how did you kind of navigate that kind of cultivating mentors, cultivating sponsors, and having, great business relationships as you've advanced your career?
Oh, that's a great question. I really think it's important for someone to put themselves out there, join organizations, sit on different boards, whether it's an alumni association, it could be a neighborhood HOA, because you never know who you're going to meet, who you can collaborate with, and what you can learn from them. So I think a funny story I'll tell is about 10 years ago, a Business Journal article came out, and it was top women leaders in Atlanta. Well, I cold called them and said, "Can I take you to coffee?" And one of them said yes. So I thought it was a great idea. She was the CFO of a large law firm in downtown Atlanta. So I went down, bought her a coffee, and we had a great afternoon. She shared with me some experiences, just some lessons, and we stayed in touch until she retired. So it was really neat.
Kristen, but before I let you go and relieve you from the mic, I am curious, just do you have any kind of final thoughts for our listeners, whether that listener is a seasoned business executive navigating growth and scaling challenges, or somebody working their way up to their career and trying to make that next step with their eyes on working toward the C-suite? Just, do you have any kind of final thoughts for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a great piece of advice is whenever the opportunity presents itself is to surround yourself with people who are maybe not necessarily more intelligent, but emotionally intelligent, experienced, have more insight, innovative thoughts. You'll never know what you'll be able to get out of people when you just ask questions and have a seat at the table.
I agree, because relationships is so important in business. So I agree. It's being surrounded by good people and having good relationships.
That's right. People love teaching and really sharing experiences.
Perfect. Kristen, thank you so much for your time. And to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions about the business concepts we discussed today or any other financial considerations you're navigating, please don't hesitate to contact us at www.mjcpa.com.